min kol dain. Kufnen zayin amar alf at the bottom. And as I explained to you, ich habe gegeben zu verstehen, wie ich verstehe das. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I understand. That this Amid, it seems very repetitive. It seems like he's repeating in Yonim from the previous blot. The chilek is, in the previous blot, he talked about the mile of mitzvahs maisius and halachas of mitzvahs maisius versus kavana, versus ruch nizach Yiddishkeit. Here he's adding another kvetch, the neshama. The neshama is into the kelim, l'chayda. So l'chayda has the mile atzmis that mitzvahs have. So if the neshama has avos Hashem and Yiddish Hashem, we have the mile se'etzim. So the Alter Rebbe explains the difference between the way the neshama is godliness and the way mitzvahs are godliness. He made several points. First of all, that mitzvahs are mevarer, and therefore they're mamshech sag, keser, and neshamas are already mavurer, and they're only man. Second of all, it may be true that the neshama comes from kelim, and kelim are akus beyetzem, but that's behelim. In a neshama, the godliness of kelim is hidden. And what's revealed is only the avos Hashem, and Yiddish Hashem, which is a ha'ora. And incidentally, he explained that neshamas Yisrael come from tipa, like mitzvahs, as opposed to malachim, which are only from neshikin. But when you're comparing neshamas to malachim, neshamas come from tipa, malachim come from ha'ora. But when you're comparing neshamas to mitzvahs, mitzvahs down here, the godliness is revealed because they come from timius hakelim, and neshamas may be godly, but the godliness is concealed. And what's revealed is only the hisbonenus and avos Hashem and Yiddish Hashem, which is only a ha'ora. This is what we learned. Ubar min kol dain. Now there's a third point. In addition to the 2 points we had earlier, I want to tell you something. In yesterday's shir, there's 2 v'oid zoises near the top of the page. There's 3 v'oid zoises. There's one on Kuf Navav and Beis at the bottom, and then there's 2 on the top of Kuf Nun Zayin. V'oid zois, and then 3 lines after Nacham of v'oid zois. And I don't understand why they're both there, because I don't see the chilik between the first v'oid zois on Kuf Nun Zayin Amar Aleph and the second v'oid zois on Kuf Nun Zayin Amar Aleph, but that's just me. Now goes the third point. In other words, the second v'oid zois is a third point, so Varmon Kol Dain should be a fourth point, but I don't see the difference, so that's how we're going to learn it. There's 3 points. The first point is that Mamitzvah Amavar Sag, Amamshech Sag is most of the Neshama. Second of all, the Neshama is Behelim, and therefore the Gili is the Ha'or. Ubarmin Kol Dain. This is the third point. That Afilu b'Neshamas Da'atzilus. Even Neshamas of Atzilus. In other words, Af Shimi Kelim Da'atzilus. Neshamas come from Kelim Da'atzilus. In other words, they come from godliness. And if they're Neshamas of Atzilus, that means they come down into this world and they continue to be godly Be'ez Galus. Most Neshamas come from Atzilus, but when they come into the lower worlds, there's a hell of a hester. So you have to have mitzvahs. But Neshama of Atzilus comes down into this world in a godly state. V'chein, as well as B'nefesh Ruach, the lower levels of the neshama of Atzilus, which is called the nefesh and the ruach of the neshama, which are mikelim, the yitzir asiyah, which come from the garments, the vessel of kelim yitzir asiyah. Hinu, hine, the chilu is chimu sichliim shalahem. Even if it's true that neshamas of Atzilus and their naran come down to this world and remain godly begilui, but their yid and their ahava, me'edidim gamkin, arouse also bekelim the yitzir asiyah in the vessel of yitzir asiyah bechinas ha'alam and matalamayla, in a sense from a lower level to a higher level. B'serusad letata, from an arousal from below. Says the Alter Rebbe, v'zehu bechinas histalkos levad chas v'sholom. It's an idea of going away alone, God forbid. In other words, even those neshamas that come from Atzilus and therefore they are lakusis begila lamata, but what they do in this world is lift, not bring down. Avo bechinas amshacham al ma'ila lamata, bringing down from a higher level to a lower level. Who are they mitzvahs ma'isi is dafke to doing physical mitzvahs. Now their Indian is lahamshachay bekelim, to bring the light into vessels, like I said at the beginning of the sugya of mitzvahs. Ubechitzenius akelim dafke, they actually bring it down to the peripheral, to the outside levels of the kelim. Shechitzenius elyon yered lamata, at the peripheral aspect of the higher level descends below. Upnimius atachtan el lamayla, and the deeper level of what's below ascends upward. V'zeu shekasla b'zeir pashas bekudei anal, like it says in Zeir pashas bekudei, the is sidura v'chulud is an order and so forth. It says is sidura chulud is a seder, and he translates in the Yiddish it is a seder that mitzvahs affects both hamshach and Allah. You bring godliness down and you lift godliness up. Ushtein zeirach gaveya, they're both for the sake of alakus. Ha'alav ve'hamshacha. When you're lifting up, it's for the sake of alakus, and when you're bringing down, it's also for the sake of alakus. Because ayah Allah sman misag. When you lift up through the birurim, you mavara gashmi if you're doing a mitzvah. You lift it up to keser, which means through action and speech. Which is the whole point of Ishtalshalus. To reveal the divine light below. And not simply to ascend, to lift up what's below, upwards. That when something is lifted up from a lower level to a higher level, besides for the fact that it's not the kavanah of the creation, it's only temporary. The afkam zeis, and moreover, the idea of aliyah itself is dafka aliyah sakelim le'eres hayenim, is lifting up the kelim to the higher lights. He ma'asa Shabbos Yom Kippurim is the level of Shabbos and Yom Kippur. In other words, when you're lifting up the kelim, that's a better thing than when you're lifting up the oil. Lifting up the oil would be a bad thing. Okay, lifting up the kelim would have a milah, but even lifting up the kelim would only be lefisha, and it wouldn't be the kavanah. But when you're lifting up the lights alone, that's a terrible thing, which is what happens at Rosh Hashanah, right? We call that dormita and yistalkus. It's not a good thing. So the Alter Rebbe says that the third reason you have to have mitzvahs maisius, and you can't rely on your neshama alone, is because mitzvahs maisius affect not just halal, lifting up godliness, but amshacha, bringing godliness down. And the neshamas Yisrael's avodah mitzad atzmei, even neshamas avatil, is only to lift up. So first of all, lifting up is only good in special occasions. Otherwise, it's only lifting up the eidos, which is the infinite stalchus. And second of all, the purpose is not to lift up, the purpose is to bring down. Okay? The neshama of a person compared to his body in this world, even by a tzaddik, by a neshama of a tzils, chashivi ke'eres lagabe kelim, is considered like the relationship between light and vessels. V'chein, as well as the chilu rechimu sichlim, the avos Hashem and yiras Hashem, lagabe mitzvahs maisi is dafke, compared to mitzvahs maisi is also considered neshama lagabe the guf, and dafke the guf is the kavanah. First of all, the kavanah of the guf is to bring godliness down. And second of all, if we're going to have a halal, it should be a law of the guf, not just only a law of the neshama. And the Alter Rebbe concludes, v'lachein, and therefore, hispal Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom Moshe Rabbeinu davened tefillis, as many tefillis communion v'oschana, like the number of the word v'oschana, 515 tefillis. Al kiyum mitzvahs ma'isi is dafke, do physical mitzvahs, v'odin l'diba gashmi, as well as speaking physical words of Torah, shalach yisrael halachas, which we learned about earlier. So the Alter Rebbe said here, and I'm using the word basically because that's all I understand is basically, I don't know more than that, that although a neshama is godliness, especially a neshama of atzilus, but first of all, the neshama's effect is aliyah and istalkus, not hamshach. First of all, the kavanah is hamshach, not aliyah and istalkus. Second of all, there's two concepts in aliyah and istalkus. If we were talking about aliyah and istalkus of kelim, that wouldn't be so bad. But if we're talking about aliyah and istalkus of the eid alone, like the Avodah of Rosh Hashanah, that would be terrible. And that's what happens when a neshama goes back to the Eibishter. When a neshama goes back to the Eibishter, compared to the guf, that's like the estalkus ha'eres without the estalkus ha'kelim. Therefore, says the Alter Rebbe, even though neshamas come from kelim and their godliness, to bring down godliness, the atmos of Atzilus lamata, you have to have mitzvahs ma'asiyah. So to summarize yesterday's shiur and the day before yesterday, Zayin and Ches, he says mitzvahs neshamas may come from kelim, but they have to have mitzvahs ma'asiyah anyway. And he enumerated what we think is three reasons. First of all, mitzvahs are mevara berurim and mamshach sag. Second of all, mitzvahs are etzem begilui, and the neshamas Yisrael, that may be that they're an etzem, but what is begilui is only a ha'ara. And third of all, the neshamas Yisrael affect aliyah, and they don't affect hamshach. To be sure, this is the end of the Yiras HaKedesh, the way I see it. Okay, obviously everything I'm telling you is my own understanding.